Welcome to our talk. The term Uptalk describes utterance final pitch rises that carry no sentence structure information. Uptalk is usually dialect or social lecture, and Australian English is particularly known for this attribute. We ask here whether experience with an Uptalk variety affects listeners' ability to categorize rising pitch contours on the basis of the timing and height of their onset and offset. Speech prosody conveys many different types of information at all levels of linguistic structures from many linguistic dimensions. One of the latter dimensions relatively little studied to date is information concerning the dialectal varietal background of the talker, to which the phenomenon belongs that we investigate in this study termed uptalk. Although it is not a new linguistic development, its name is fairly new and attached research interest in recent decades. Uptalk, as the name suggests, refers to the prevalence of intonational rises in speech. Intonational rises have linguistic functions, of course, signaling a question as opposed to a statement is particularly common across languages, as is the junctional function of signaling phrasal boundary. Uptalk, however, denotes rises used when no such linguistic function is being served. Utterances may finish on a rising intonation even when the utterance is an ordinary matter-of-fact statement. Particular dialects of English have long been known to exhibit this pattern, and it can vary across dialects in its realization, or it can be suggested to be typical of particular talker groups. For our purposes, a relevant aspect of the uptalk phenomena is that it's highly common in Australian English, where its use is very widespread, such that it's observed both across generations and across different parts of country. There is a growing literature on the precise realization of uptalk and on the speaker-related variables, for example, sex, age, and ethnicity, which are correlated with the use of this style. Remarkably, however, to our knowledge, there has been extremely little work on the perception of utterances with uptalk. This means that even basic knowledge of the role of uptalk in speech communication is as yet lacking. Do speakers of different variety develop differing sensitivity to F0 just as tone language users, in whose language languages F0 cues tell lexical items apart, can have different expectation of intonational cues to syntactic structure than those of non-tone language users, and can uptalk be adapted to rapidly by users of another variety of the same L1 and importantly by L2 learners? Fletcher and Lokes 2006 presented Australian English listeners with short utterances that had been artificially manipulated to have final rises that were shorter or longer and began earlier or later. The listeners were able to develop biases in their responses in that they were more likely to hear longer rises as questions and shorter rises as statements, which is in keeping with the actual distribution of final rises in their language variety. This very usefully suggests that users of an uptalk variety at least can adapt to unusual realization of F0 in short utterances and can categorize them systematically. This performance may be crucially based on the perceptual experience they have built up, but since the study in question included no other listener groups, we cannot be certain about that. Perhaps any listeners with some experience of the variety in question can do it, or even any listeners with the same L1, or perhaps listeners who are certain to be sensitive to F0 can do it. Indeed, across the course of such an experiment, it is perhaps possible for anyone at all to set up functional distinctive categorization responses. Building on this foundation, we here investigate these further questions in a way similar to that used in Fletcher's work. We manipulated the F0 applied to three-word English phrases that could potentially function as either a statement or question. We then asked listeners to speedily categorize each utterance accordingly. First 19 sentences with the same syntactic structure got a noun, but each with a different noun, animal, banana, and so on, were created that could be interpreted either as a statement, I have got a noun, or as a question, have you got a noun, such as in a card game situation. The sentences were recorded by a female Australian English speaker. The speaker was instructed to produce the sentences with the rising contour end as Uptalk. A range of manipulation were then performed using Pratt. The original F0 information for each sentence was replaced by a set of predetermined rising contours that were manipulated to change the pitch level of the nuclear rise onset, the pitch level of the nuclear rise offset, low, high, and the time of the nuclear rise onset earlier or later. The two former variables were used in the previous studies and reported to affect the perception of high rise in terminals by Australian L1 listeners, and latter variables also reported in other studies. So let's listen to the two stimuli example. Early, low, low.
Got a flower?
Got a flower?
Early, low, high.
Got a
Got a
flower?
flower?
Here's the results. Overall, Australian English users made 39% statement responses. With this as an intercept, a generalized linear mixed effects regression model was built with binary responses as dependent measure, participant group as fixed factors, and participant and word as random factor, including random slopes for the fixed factors, in order to obtain a global picture of the participant performance. German without experience group produced the highest proportion of the statement responses, namely 51%, followed by American listeners, namely 51%. Then by German with the experience, 43%, and the lowest proportion was shown by Mandarin listeners, 32%. Thus, the experienced German listeners did not differ in overall proportion of statement responses from the Australian English native groups, while the other groups did. Nevertheless, German with the experience, American English listeners, and German without the experience groups neither differ from one another. Further, these non-Australian English groups' mean responses did not differ significantly from the chance level. Analysis of the binary phonetic variables low, high rise onset and offset and early or late rise onset revealed that only Australian English listeners gave more statement responses in the low rise onset condition compared to the high one. This pattern corroborates in that low rise onset most strongly determined the perception of uptalk. Australian English L1 differed from the four non-Australian English groups in this. Furthermore, a learning effect was analyzed using the GLM model and with binary responses as a dependent measure and participant group and quartile 1 to 4 as fixed factors and participants as and word as random factors. The results revealed an interaction between participant groups and item number, so quartile, and except for Mandarin listeners, all other participant groups show a learning effect, more statement responses with an increased item number. And for a better understanding of complex interactions, the data was split for each participant group. While Mandarin listeners did not show any significant differences between the quartiles, Australian English listeners showed a learning effect in the fourth quartile compared to the first one, and American English listeners showed constant increase of statement responses in the course of the experiment, and two learners groups also showed a similar effect. The participant group with the most extensive experience was Australian English listeners. They showed that even with the stripped down audio with which they were presented here, they were able to form categories in a systematic manner. Their responses relied principally on low rise onset as evidence of an uptalk instance, which is in line with preferences exhibited in previous studies. The use of uptalk in their native variety Australian English has enabled them to interpret the fine-graded structure of F0 contours, even though the precise realization here were simple abstractions from the natural productions on which their experience was based. Our following cross-group comparisons allow us to answer a number of further questions concerning this ability and to begin to build up a comprehensive picture of such perceptual skills. First, we examine whether listeners whose L1 is a tone language and hence requires extensive lexical use of F0 could make use of pitch cues of this kind presented here. This proved not to be the case. Not only did these listeners not categorize the input in a systematic manner, they were also the only group to display no evidence of learning during the course of the experiment. Note that in post-experiment debriefings, these listeners self-reported that they chose question responses if they heard a rising contour, and this was an unfortunate strategy given that all stimuli in fact had terminal rises. They were indeed the group with the highest proportion of question responses and, in consequence, the lowest proportion of statement responses. They also reported not to have been aware of uptalk patterns in English. This is an interesting fact since it suggests that their expectations of the role of F0 may be constrained by their L1 experience, in which the role of F0 is predominantly to convey lexical distinctions. Clearly, having more extensive experience with F0 in general did not provide the Mandarin group with a processing advantage in the present study, even when they had acquired experiences of the Australian English usage of F0. We turn next to the German group with experience of listening to Australian English. For this group, there is also a control group without experience of uptalk, so that it is possible to assess the effect of that listening experience while other experimental factors are effectively held constant. Here, neither group's result exactly resemble the Australian English responses patterns. It is not the case that Australian English exposure that the one German group had received was enough to essentially turn them into accomplished Australian listeners. However, the two German groups also did not display exactly the same pattern. Both groups showed evidence of learning across the experiment, and overall, the group with experience of Australian English produced a pattern that was closer to the Australian English pattern than was the case for the German group without such experience. We do not know how much exposure would be necessary for these listeners to pattern like the native Australian English listeners, but it is clear that unlike the Mandarin listeners, the German group were indeed able to translate their listening experience into a degree of processing advantage. The phonological structure of German is a lot closer to that of English than is the phonological structure of Mandarin, of course. But this closeness of phonological structure was not a major factor in the results. Given that the group of German listeners without Australian English experience did not pattern like the Australian English listeners at all, while those with experience did show a tendency to do so. It is the prior experience that is a factor that has enabled that outcome. Note, however, that both the German groups exhibited a learning effect across the experiment, in that their proportion of statement choices gradually increased. In this respect, the German groups differ from the Mandarin group. Here, our final test group, the American English listeners, provided confirmatory evidence. This group, with English as their L1, had no advantage over the German listeners in their overall results pattern. Like both German groups, and unlike the Mandarin group, they did, however, show evidence of learning across the experiment. In other words, even when the L1 is the same, it is absolutely necessary to have had prior listening experience of an uptalk variety in order to show rapid ability to categorize uptalk like pitch contours in a systematic manner. We conclude, therefore, that only specific experience with a particular variety can help to build precise sensitivity to that variety of pitch contour pattern. Notwithstanding this, there is potentially good news for all language users in the general learning effect that we have observed across the course of the experiment for most listener groups. This pattern suggests that it should be possible for any listeners to acquire this ability with sufficient exposure. The only bar to such acquisition arises when the listener's L1 uses the phonological feature in a question, here F0, for quite different linguistic purposes, as was the case with our Mandarin listener group. This study has therefore taken the first step towards mapping the perception of uptalk by users of languages or varieties without uptalk. There is much more yet to be learned, but the indications are that a varietal future such as Uptalk is not likely to cause widespread communication difficulty. This project was funded by an Australian-German joint research cooperation scheme awarded to Prof. Dr. Anne Cutler and Andrea Weber for SpeechNet Baden-Württemberg. We further acknowledge support from the China Scholarship Council awarded to Yuan and from the Australian Research Council awarded to Dr. Mark Antoniou and Prof. Dr. Anne Cutler. Testing of the American English group was enabled by the Department of Linguistics at the University of Maryland. Thank you very much.